A fierce gun battle against outlaws, a determined young woman inheriting her beloved's land, and a future built from grit and vision. This saga of Redwood Ranch is filled with heart-stopping moments. Lydia Caldwell arrived in Wyoming expecting marriage only to find tragic loss and a ranch on the brink of ruin. Yet she refused to turn back. Instead, she took up arms, fought for her claim, and transformed Redwood into a symbol of perseverance on the wild frontier. If you're excited by tales of daring showdowns and the unbreakable bond between a rancher and her land, stay with us until the very end. We'll reveal how Lydia juggles new alliances, faces final challenges, and ultimately shapes her own destiny under the vast Wyoming sky. And don't forget, if you love stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more gripping adventures and uplifting endings. Let's return now to the unfolding drama at Redwood Ranch. Lydia Caldwell first glimpsed the wide plains of the Wyoming Territory from the dusty window of a stagecoach that had borne her across half a continent. For 6 grueling weeks, she had endured cramped quarters, stale biscuits, and the ceaseless jostle of wagon wheels over rugged terrain, sustained only by the promise that a man she had never met awaited her in the settlement of Silver Creek. His name was Andrew Fisher, owner of Redwood Ranch, and their letters had painted an idyllic vision, a modest homestead on fertile grasslands, a handful of cattle, and a future they would forge hand in hand. At 27, Lydia had left behind the lingering echo of family debts in Boston, the polite suffocation of finishing schools, and a clerk's position that barely kept her above ruin. She had sewn her entire savings into the hem of her best dress, trusting that Andrew's letters of steady warmth and practical ambition would provide her a new start on the frontier. Arriving at Silver Creek as the last passenger on the stage, Lydia half expected to see Andrew's smiling face, or at least the battered ranch wagon he had mentioned in his final letter. Instead, she was greeted by curious stares from a handful of townsfolk and the guarded expression of Sheriff Silas Walters, a lean man with a salt and pepper mustache. The stage driver, weary from 1,000 miles of dust handed down Lydia's 2 trunks, then muttered that she should speak with the sheriff regarding her arrangements. That single word, arrangements, rang ominous as she stepped onto the boardwalk, painfully aware of being a stranger in a land that seemed both harsh and achingly beautiful. Sheriff Walters removed his hat, revealing thinning hair, and addressed her with careful solemnity. "Miss Caldwell, I'm afraid there's news about Mr. Fisher. You'd best hear in private." His quiet tone made Lydia's stomach clench. He led her across the street to his small office where an aging pot-bellied stove offered scant warmth. There he explained with practiced gentleness what had happened. A wagon train bound for Silver Creek had been ambushed outside a canyon 3 days prior. Andrew Fisher and 2 of his ranch hands had been part of that wagon group. None survived the massacre. The outlaws responsible were rumored to be the Ramsey Gang, led by Frank Ramsey himself, desperados who had roamed the territory for a year, rustling cattle, robbing stages, and now apparently escalating to murder. Lydia heard the sheriff's words as though through a tunnel. Andrew's name, the word ambush, the phrase, "no survivors." They coalesced into a dreadful finality that pressed the breath from her lungs. She had come all this way for a man she never got to meet, for a life she would never share. Numbly, she asked Sheriff Walters about Redwood Ranch, what would happen to it, who would care for it now. The sheriff shook his head, explaining that Andrew had no known family in the territory and no will on record. The bank might foreclose, or a larger rancher might buy it up cheap. The ground seemed to tilt under Lydia's feet at the thought. Return to Boston. She had sold her father's last heirloom watch just to afford stage fare. She had resigned her meager position in a clerk's office. She possessed no home, no prospects, and a meager sum of money sewn into her skirt. "I want to see Redwood Ranch." Lydia insisted, the conviction in her voice surprising even herself. The sheriff tried cautioning her about the many dangers, not least the existence of the Ramsey Gang, but Lydia's resolve had already hardened. A funeral for Andrew and the others was scheduled for the following morning, and after that she intended to travel to Redwood Ranch to see with her own eyes the place Andrew had described so vividly in his letters. Perhaps she thought that ranch was all she had left to tether her to the frontier. And so, ignoring the pitying glances of those in Silver Creek, Lydia took the first step in a journey that would reshape not just Redwood Ranch, but her own destiny as well. The next morning dawned bleak, as though the wide Wyoming sky itself mourned. Lydia stood at the edge of a small cemetery plot beyond Silver Creek's wooden church, the wind tugging at her bonnet ribbons. She was not alone, though she felt a singular grief no one else could quite share. On her left, a widow named Anna Fletcher cradled a baby while 2 older children held onto her skirts. Her husband, Mark Fletcher, had perished in the same ambush that claimed Andrew Fisher's life. On Lydia's right, a rail-thin ranch hand with downcast eyes and calloused hands wiped away tears for a brother or cousin, also lost. The modest coffins rested on stands, and the air bristled with the rawness of lives cut short. Reverend Hawthorne spoke words of comfort about how the frontier tested souls, about how hope sprang from adversity, and about how those who died forging new lives in untamed lands would earn a special reverence among those who continued on. Lydia mostly heard the wind, the shuffle of boots, the trembling breath of Anna Fletcher as she tried to hold her children steady. The pastor's concluding prayer felt both too brief and too long. When it was over, people drifted away in small clusters, offering hushed condolences. Lydia remained uncertain whether it was appropriate for her to linger at Andrew's coffin. She had never met him yet. Everything she had done in the last 6 weeks had been for him or because of him. A woman in her 30s stepped forward, wearing a sturdy dress more functional than fashionable, her hair pinned back in a plain coil. She introduced herself as Harriet Roberts, saying quietly that her husband had known Andrew, that their ranch lay just north of Redwood. "I'm sorry," Harriet said. "This is no welcome for you. Andrew wrote about you. You know he was full of excitement that you were coming." Harriet's quiet sincerity touched Lydia's heart. She asked about Harriet's own ranch, which Harriet said she ran with her son Kevin. Harriet then asked the dreaded question, "Will you stay or return east?" Lydia felt the dryness in her throat. "I need to see Redwood Ranch." Andrew's letter spoke of it as though it were paradise, albeit a rugged one. Harriet gave a sad little smile and offered to accompany Lydia if she wished. "I can't tomorrow," Harriet admitted, "but soon, if you need help, come find us." Later that day, Lydia left the Silver Creek Hotel with Sheriff Walters, who had promised to escort her to Redwood Ranch. They traveled by wagon, its wheels clattering over dusty tracks that cut through rolling hills. The silence weighed on Lydia like a leaden cloak. Occasionally, she asked the sheriff about Frank Ramsey, the infamous outlaw rumored to be behind the wagon massacre. Walters explained that Ramsey ran a gang of at least a half-dozen men, possibly more rustling cattle robbing wayward travelers, and now apparently attacking wagon trains that carried anything of value. "We're spread thin," he lamented, "and the territory is vast. I can't police every canyon or ridge." As midday passed, they crested a hill, and Walters pointed to a distant smudge of green set beside a winding creek. "That's Redwood Ranch," he said, reining in the horses. From this vantage, Lydia could make out a modest cabin, a barn and fences that enclosed a scattering of cattle. The place looked smaller than Andrew's, letters had implied, but it was undeniably picturesque, framed by gentle slopes and a stretch of water lined with willow and cottonwood trees. The sheriff's tone carried regret. Andrew spoke of grand plans, adding stock building, another barn, maybe an orchard. He was a dreamer, I guess. Lydia stared at the distant cabin, her emotions a knot of grief, curiosity, and a seedling of resolve. She recalled how Andrew's letters described Redwood Ranch as a sanctuary with fertile soil, a dependable creek, and enough open range to run a decent herd. Even from a distance, she sensed the potential in that land. "I want to see it up close," she said. Walters nodded and they nudged the horses forward. Arriving in the yard, Lydia felt an ache clutch her chest. The house bore signs of recent abandonment, a bucket lying on its side, a shutter left half open, and the distinct hush of a place once lovingly tended, but now left empty. Opening the cabin door, Walters stepped in, first scanning for any sign of intrusion. Finding none, he beckoned Lydia. Inside a plain wooden table bore a half-finished letter addressed to her, the ink blotched as though Andrew had been called away mid-sentence. A small cot with a homemade quilt, a single shelf holding a few books, and a ledger on the desk, told the story of Andrew Fisher's modest beginning. Walter set down his hat. "I don't know how you'll manage this alone," he said gently. "Running a ranch is no easy feat for even the hardiest men, and you have no legal claim if Andrew left no will naming you as heiress." Lydia traced her fingers over the simple ledger on the desk, noticing neat columns of figures representing cattle counts, feed costs, and a slow but steady profit. Andrew had been methodical, the numbers telling a story of aspiration and discipline. "I traveled 2,000 miles for a life here," she replied, voice trembling only slightly. "It's all I have left. I can't just walk away." The sheriff sighed, adjusting his gun belt. "Then I'll say this. Redwood is remote, the nearest neighbor, a good ride away. The Ramsey gang is still out there, and bigger ranchers might try to force a sale." He spread his hands in a helpless gesture. "I can't protect you every hour, But if you insist on staying, I'll do what I can. Lydia nodded, grateful for at least that slim assurance. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, she stood on the rough-hewn porch, gazing at the land Andrew Fisher had poured his hopes into. Her own hopes now mingled with his unfulfilled dreams, forging an unsteady but powerful determination. Whatever Redwood Ranch was, it would be hers to shape or hers to lose in the days and trials to come. The following morning, Lydia awoke to the unfamiliar hush of Redwood Ranch. She had spent her first night in Andrew's cabin, lying sleepless on the cot that still held faint traces of his presence. A well-worn pillow, a stack of letters, and the whiff of pipe tobacco. The sheriff had remained only until dusk, then returned to Silver Creek, promising to check on her in a few days. His parting glance spoke volumes about his doubts. Lydia felt them keenly as she stirred the embers of the old fireplace for warmth. Stepping outside, she was greeted by the biting chill of a Wyoming morning. Her breath formed clouds as she scanned the property. A modest corral where a single horse eyed her warily, a barn that leaned slightly but seemed structurally sound, and beyond that open pasture sloping to the creek's edge. Patches of dew glistened on fence posts while a handful of cattle grazed in the distance. This land was hauntingly beautiful in its austerity, yet it held the threat of isolation, especially for a woman untrained in the craft of ranching. While rummaging in the barn, Lydia discovered a battered trunk with Andrew's initials, AF. Opening it revealed basic supplies, rope, a branding iron with the Redwood Ranch, mark, a hammer, nails, and bits of harness. She also found a saddle and bridle, set in decent condition. No ranch hand was in sight, but the ledger indicated that Andrew usually hired someone named David Lane. During the busiest months, checking the last entries, she saw that David's seasonal help typically began in late spring. A month from now, she'd have to manage alone until then, if he even returned at all. That day, Lydia explored Redwood Ranch more thoroughly. She donned sturdy boots and ventured along a faint path by the creek, noting how the water meandered across the property's length. A small orchard, bare branches just beginning to bud, suggested Andrew had started planting fruit trees for personal use or future sales. A handwritten note in the ledger had mentioned apple saplings from a traveling nursery wagon. She stopped by a tiny fenced plot where a handful of vegetable seedlings peeked through the soil, the promise of a personal garden if she persevered. Late in the afternoon, while nailing loose boards on the corral fence, her arms already sore from hammering, she noticed the arrival of a rider. Tenzing Lydia recalled the Ramsey gang's reputation. Quickly, she set aside the hammer and retrieved Andrew's revolver from her belt, just in case. But as the rider drew nearer, she relaxed at the sight of Harriet Roberts, the rancher who had introduced herself at the funeral. Harriet approached at an unhurried pace, raising a hand in greeting. "Thought I'd see how you fared on your first day," Harriet said, dismounting her chestnut mare. She wore the practical garb of a woman accustomed to ranch life, a wide-brimmed hat, a man's shirt tucked into skirts that were cut for riding astride. Lydia offered a tired smile. "I'm managing, though. I feel like a child learning to walk again. Every chore is new to me." Harriet's face softened. "I can lend some help, at least show you the basics. Redwood's a decent spread, but it'll require constant effort." Andrew was conscientious, but ranching is never easy, even for the most seasoned among us. She paused, surveying the half-mended fence. "Let's see if we can get this corral secure before sundown. We don't want that horse wandering off." Working alongside Harriet gave Lydia her first real lesson in practical ranch tasks. Together they hammered nails, tested boards, and replaced rotted wood. Harriet's instructions were concise, her manner patient but never patronizing. While they toiled, Harriet explained that her own ranch, the H-Bar, wasn't large, but produced enough beef to sustain her small family. She offered to exchange some of Andrew's orchard apples, once they were ready, for help with branding or hauling feed. The notion of forging alliances warmed Lydia's heart. Perhaps Redwood Ranch wouldn't be a solitary fortress after all. Before leaving, Harriet offered a final piece of advice. "Ramsey's gang is still out there, so be cautious. Keep a rifle nearby. And if you see suspicious riders, don't try to handle them alone. Ride to the H-Bar or to Silver Creek." Lydia nodded, aware the threat was real. She was a newcomer, female and vulnerable in the eyes of many, but Harriet's visit offered a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe she wouldn't have to navigate this perilous landscape entirely by herself. The following week tested Lydia's fortitude in unexpected ways. She discovered that Andrew's horse, a stocky bay named Copper, was friendly enough, but she had only basic experience riding. Moreover, there were calves to count, feed to stockpile, fences to patrol, and all the while an undercurrent of tension simmered. Each dawn, Lydia awakened with a flicker of worry about how to secure Redwood Ranch from both human and natural threats. On the sixth day of her solitary regimen, she was returning from a quick ride around the perimeter when she spotted distant figures approaching from the east. Anxiety flared. The ranch buildings offered no immediate vantage point, so she guided Copper near an outcropping, rummaging for Andrew's old spyglass that she now carried in her saddlebag. Peering through it, she spotted three riders, each armed, judging by the rifles slung across their backs. The memory of the Ramsey gang threatened to unsettle her nerve, but she forced calmness. Leading the riders was a tall man with a pronounced limp who slowed upon nearing Redwood's boundary. They wore battered hats and dust-coated jackets, looking like men accustomed to living rough. Lydia dismounted, revolver within reach, but before she could decide how to confront them, the man with the limp raised a hand in a gesture that suggested he wished to talk rather than shoot. With her heart pounding, Lydia returned the gesture. "Afternoon, ma'am." The man greeted, stopping a respectful distance away. "Name's Jonas Carter. We heard Redwood got a new occupant. We're not here for trouble." Behind him, the other two men kept their hands near their weapons, but they didn't draw. Lydia studied Jonas's expression, which seemed genuinely cautious rather than threatening. "I'm Lydia Caldwell," she replied, "and Redwood belongs to me now, though I'm well aware not everyone accepts that." Jonas nodded. "We aren't here on anyone else's behalf. We just want to know if you're hiring. We used to work for the Double C until it folded. Heard Andrew Fisher had some openings." Lydia almost laughed at the irony. Andrew had been planning to hire more help for the season, but with Andrew gone, she hadn't the funds or experience to supervise multiple workers. Still, Redwood needed capable hands if she was to keep it running. "The ranch doesn't have a formal crew, only me and part-time help from Harriet Roberts next door," she explained. "I'm not in a position to hire a large crew just now." Jonas exchanged a glance with his companions. "Understood. We could bunk in the barn for a few days if you let us prove ourselves. Fix fences, wrangle strays, let you see if we're worth wages." Her immediate instinct was caution, remembering that Andrew had died at the hands of outlaws, but Jonas Carter didn't seem like the violent sort. His men, though heavily armed, wore the anxious air of drifters seeking honest work. Lydia reasoned that Harriet or the sheriff might offer perspective if these men were known troublemakers. "I'll think about it," she said, choosing partial honesty. "But I need to talk with some neighbors and my friend Harriet Roberts." "You can check back in a couple of days," Jonas acknowledged the caution, leading his men away without pressing. That evening, Lydia debated the offer while cooking a solitary supper. Redwood Ranch needed labor, but how could she trust men she didn't know? Harriet had once told her that the West thrived on the interplay of trust and vigilance. Too much of one without the other led to either exposure or paranoia. As dusk fell, Lydia walked the fence line near the corral. Letting her thoughts settle, a man like Jonas Carter with a limp and two hired guns could be a liability or a blessing. She needed Harriet's counsel. The next day, Harriet arrived with Kevin in tow, both leading fresh supplies to help Lydia build a secure feed shed for the coming winter. Over coffee, Lydia recounted Jonas Carter's proposal. Harriet frowned, chewing her lip. "Carter used to break wild Mustangs for a ranch near the ridges. I never heard he was involved in rustling or the Ramsey gang, but I'd still proceed carefully. If they're honest drifters, fine. If not," she shrugged. That night, Lydia rummaged through Andrew's desk once more, hoping to find mention of Jonas Carter or any potential hires. She discovered references to David Lane, who was due in a couple of weeks, and a note about perhaps recruiting additional hands if the herd grew as projected. But no mention of Carter sighing. She placed the papers aside. If Redwood was to expand, as Andrew had once dreamed, or even just maintain itself under the looming threat of the Ramsey gang, she needed manpower. Whether Jonas Carter's group would fill that role remained to be seen. Outside, the Wyoming moon illuminated the ranch yard with a cold silver glow. Lydia stepped onto the porch holding a lantern high. The night air carried a hint of sage and the distant bark of a coyote. Her hand went reflexively to the revolver at her hip. She had come far further than she'd ever imagined, from a naive bride-to-be to a resolute rancher who'd had to kill a man in self-defense. The transformation felt both shocking and natural, a testament to how the land molded those who chose to remain upon it. 1 week later, David Lane arrived on a dusty bay horse, tipping his hat. "In quiet greeting, Miss Caldwell," he said politely, removing the worn Stetson as he introduced himself. He looked barely 19 with a sandy mop of hair and freckles, but he moved with the self-assurance of someone raised on horseback. "Mr. Fisher told me last season to come by Redwood in late May. I'm sorry about what happened." His voice grew soft with sorrow. "He was a good man." Lydia felt a familiar pang of grief. She extended her hand, which he shook respectfully. Thank you, David. Andrew spoke highly of you in his notes. I hope we can continue the arrangement if you're willing to work under new management. David nodded readily, slinging his saddlebag to the porch. I'd be glad to, ma'am. Not many ranches around here are taking on new hands, especially with the trouble from the Ramsey gang. Redwood's a fine spread. Be ashamed to let it go idle. His words echoed Harriet's sentiment that Redwood possessed potential beyond its modest size. If it was to flourish, Lydia needed all the help she could get. Then welcome, she said, offering him coffee. Let's go over the tasks Andrew had planned. They settled at the cabin's table with Lydia opening the ledger. She'd reorganized its entries, adding fresh notes about the new fences Harriet and Kevin had helped construct, the orchard's slow but steady growth, and the possible addition of more cattle if finances allowed. David studied the figures, occasionally pointing to an entry and muttering, "Yeah," Mr. Fisher said. "We'd try for another 20 head. Come next spring." He glanced up, mild surprise on his face. "You've done a lot in a short time, Miss Caldwell." "It's not enough yet," Lydia replied. "But I've had help from Harriet Roberts and a couple of short-term hires." She paused, remembering Jonas Carter's suggestion. She still hadn't decided whether to hire Carter and his men, suspecting it might be more trouble than it was worth. Yet Redwood Ranch needed more than 2 or 3 hands to expand properly. In the swirling complexities of the frontier, every decision felt like a gamble. Late that afternoon, Lydia and David were inspecting the orchard when Harriet arrived leading a second horse loaded with seed and a few essential tools. Kevin followed with a small wagon full of feed sacks. "We saw you needed extra feed for the younger calves," Harriet explained, nodding and greeting. Her gaze then fell on David, who introduced himself politely. Harriet's eyes lit with approval. Andrew often spoke well of David Lane, glad to see Redwoods continuing with dedicated help. David stepped aside to unload the feed from the wagon, giving Harriet and Lydia a moment to confer. Harriet fixed Lydia with a contemplative look. "Rumor has it Jonas Carter is drifting around the area again, angling for work. You seen him yet?" Lydia exhaled, wiping sweat from her brow. "He came by offering to fix fences in exchange for a place to bunk and maybe wages later. I wasn't sure about him, so I said no for now." Harriet nodded. "Best to trust your gut. This region's full of folks looking for a quick dollar, and Redwood's vulnerability might attract them." They stood beneath one of Andrew's apple saplings, which displayed delicate blossoms. The orchard's progress felt symbolic of Lydia's own journey, fragile yet pushing forward. The conversation shifted to practical matters, expanding the corral, improving irrigation for the garden, perhaps building a small bunkhouse if Redwood's staff ever grew larger. Kevin, finishing with the feed, joined them, removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. "You know, Miss Caldwell, he said my mother's always telling me to avoid stepping on your toes, but if you ever want a full partnership, we could discuss it." Harriet gave her son a reproachful look, but Lydia just smiled, recognizing his sincerity. "I'll keep that in mind," Lydia replied tactfully, her heart warmed by the Roberts family's unwavering support. After Harriet and Kevin departed, Lydia stood with David, watching them disappear into the gold-tinged distance. "Good people," David remarked, echoing Lydia's own thoughts. She nodded, feeling a quiet gratefulness. Redwood no longer felt like a lonely outpost. It had become part of a small network of neighbors and friends, forging alliances through shared labor and mutual respect. That sense of community was what Andrew had depicted in his letters, and Lydia realized with a bittersweet pang that she was finally living the life he'd invited her to share. The turning point came one sweltering afternoon in mid-June when Lydia and David were rounding up stray calves near the creek. The sky shimmered with heat, and the cicadas droned ceaselessly among the cottonwoods. After corralling 3 wayward calves, they paused to let the horses drink. The quiet hush of the water's edge belied the tension that had crept into Lydia's thoughts recently. A ranch hand from another spread had gone missing, rumored to be victim of the Ramsey gang. A sudden shout rang out from the road. Lydia jerked her head up to see Jonas Carter and his 2 companions thundering across Redwood land, making a direct line for the creek. They carried rifles, though not brandished in immediate threat. "Miss Caldwell," Jonas called, slowing his horse. "We need to talk." David guided his mount closer to Lydia, obviously wary, but she raised a hand in cautious acknowledgement. Jonas had come uninvited in broad daylight. Some urgency must have driven him. "I told you I wasn't sure about hiring," Lydia said, swallowing her tension as Jonas dismounted. He was dusty and perspiring, the deep lines on his face accentuated by the harsh sun. "This ain't about that," Jonas replied, glancing over his shoulder at his men, who remained astride Ramsey's gang, is on the move. Word is they have turned their sights on Redwood because you refused to sell and because you took down Frank Ramsey's cousin near that canyon. Confusion flickered through Lydia. She had shot Frank Ramsey, not his cousin, but if Jonas was mixing facts or if the rumor had mutated, the essential point remained: the gang believed Redwood was responsible for Frank's death. David stiffened. Frank Ramsey led the massacre that killed Andrew Fisher. He got what he deserved, Jonas nodded, though he looked uncomfortable. That's not how the gang sees it. They figure Redwood's occupant is a threat. They might be planning to raid your ranch. Lydia felt her pulse kick up. She tried to maintain vigilance, but had the territory's outlaws truly singled out Redwood again? Jonas continued, "Look, I've no love for the Ramsey gang, but I also can't afford to cross them. I only came to warn you so you're not caught off guard." Lydia realized that Jonas's earlier talk of wanting a job was overshadowed now by his fear that the entire region could erupt in violence if the gang decided to make an example of Redwood. "Thank you for the warning," she said carefully, "but what do you suggest I do?" "Abandon Redwood's surrender." Jonas's expression fell into grim lines. "I don't know. Maybe gather some neighbors, fortify the ranch. They'll come at night or when your guard is down. I'd hate to see your blood spilled over land that was never worth the trouble it's caused." "Redwood is worth every trouble," Lydia shot back, the fierce loyalty surprising even herself. "If Ramsey's gang tries to attack, we'll defend ourselves." Jonas glanced at David, whose set jaw confirmed his readiness to fight. He sighed, scuffing the dirt with a boot. "Then I hope you have enough guns. Because if rumors are right, they might strike soon, and they're not known for half measures." When Jonas and his men rode off, Lydia felt her heart racing with a mix of gratitude and dread. Jonas might be a wandering opportunist, but he'd given her a crucial warning. She and David returned to the cabin where they made a swift inventory of weapons and ammunition. David noted that Harriet and Kevin Roberts, along with a few other neighbors, could possibly rally to Redwood's aid if given notice. "We'll need a plan," Lydia said, remembering how the confrontation with Harrove had demanded careful strategy. This time the threat could be even more lethal. By day's end, Lydia had scrawled a half-dozen letters to Harriet Roberts, to the sheriff, to local ranchers with whom Redwood had friendly dealings, requesting urgent assistance or at least awareness of the gang's new intentions. She and David took turns riding out to deliver the messages, each trip laced with an undercurrent of tension as they rode the dusty trails, uncertain which bend might hide an outlaw's rifle. The rest of the ranch's chores, fence repairs, orchard tending, herding fell into a frantic backdrop of mounting alarm. That night, Lydia lay awake reading by lamplight from an agriculture guide Andrew had once annotated, but her mind kept drifting to the image of Frank Ramsey, who had terrorized so many lying dead by her hand. If Jonas's warning was accurate, the gang's new leader or remaining members might want revenge. Fear gnawed at her stomach, yet overshadowed by the steely resolve that Redwood was her home, the only stake she had in this raw, expansive land. She would not give it up. Within 2 days, Harriet and Kevin Roberts arrived, accompanied by Anna Fletcher, the widow from the funeral, and her teenage son, along with 2 other ranchers who had grown to respect Lydia's resolve. They made a small band of defenders in Redwood's yard, and as dusk settled, the orchard's delicate branches rustled in a faint breeze that provided little comfort from the tension thick in the air. Harriet wore a revolver strapped around her waist, an uncharacteristic accessory that underscored the seriousness of their vigil. Sheriff Walters hadn't arrived, though word had been sent. Silver Creek was more than a morning's ride away, and the sheriff might be tied up with other responsibilities or uncertain intelligence. Lydia had quietly recognized that Redwood might stand alone if Ramsey's gang struck swiftly. She tried to remain calm as she directed final preparations, bracing fence lines, ensuring water was available near the barn in case outlaws tried to set a fire, distributing extra ammunition from the carefully hoarded stock. Kevin Roberts helped David position rifles and vantage points around the cabin. Anna Fletcher's son, Tom, barely 14, was posted in the barn loft with a small shotgun, his eyes wide but determined. Anna herself displayed a fierce maternal resolve. She would defend Redwood as she once had to defend her own small homestead after her husband's death. Harriet and Lydia found themselves standing side by side in the orchard after all tasks were done, each holding a lantern. "You sure you want to be out here if a fight starts?" Harriet asked quietly. Lydia nodded. "If Ramsey's men come, I want to see them before they see me." Nightfall came slowly, the summer sky shifting from gold to pink, then a deepening purple. The group ate a subdued meal in shifts, half keeping watch while the others fortified themselves with stew and bread. Lydia had hastily prepared. Conversations were hushed, each person aware that the quiet of night might be shattered by the thunder of hooves or the crack of gunfire. As the hours dragged on without event, some dared hope that Jonas's warning had been overblown. Perhaps the gang had found a different target or quarreled among themselves. Shortly after midnight, the harsh cry of a horse jolted everyone to alertness. David spotted movement on the eastern slope. A faint glow like a creeping line of embers advanced against the darkness. Lydia's heart clenched. Torches. Harriet's voice cut the silence. They're here. The defenders hurried to their positions, lanterns doused to avoid becoming targets. Lydia crouched behind a stack of timber near the orchard's edge. Rifle in hand, Harriet beside her. They had agreed on a single principle: hold their fire until absolutely necessary. If the gang simply wanted to intimidate, perhaps there'd be room to negotiate or scare them off. But the men who emerged from the darkness carried themselves with swaggering menace, 6 or 7 riders, the light of their torches casting twisted shadows across Redwood's yard. One rider led the group, brandishing a rifle in one hand, a torch in the other. Lydia's mouth went dry. She recognized neither him nor the men behind him, meaning these were likely new recruits or leftover members of the Ramsey gang, determined to avenge Frank's death. The lead rider halted near the corral. "We know you're there, Caldwell," he shouted, his voice rough. "Think you can kill Frank Ramsey and live peacefully? We'll burn Redwood to the ground and watch you run like a scared rabbit." Lydia exchanged a glance with Harriet, who gave a curt nod. From behind the barn, David yelled, "Leave now. We're armed and the law will be on you if you don't turn around." The outlaw's laugh echoed. "The law? Out here we are the law." Another rider flung a torch onto a patch of dry grass near the corral fence. Flames burst to life, scattering orange sparks. With that, the night erupted in gunfire. Harriet raised her rifle, took aim at a man about to hurl a second torch, and fired. He yelped, dropping the torch, which sputtered on the ground. Lydia pressed the rifle stock against her shoulder, trying to steady her breath as she targeted a mounted figure who was aiming his pistol toward Kevin. She pulled the trigger. Her bullet struck the man's horse, causing it to rear. The rider toppled off with a shocked oath. Shouts, curses, and the acrid scent of burning grass overwhelmed Lydia's senses. She reloaded, the mechanical repetition of slotting a new cartridge providing a grim focus. A bullet whizzed past her ear, thunking into a tree trunk behind her. Harriet fired again, cursing as her bullet went wide. David and Kevin poured shots from the barn and upper corral, the flashes of muzzle fire stabbing at the darkness. The outlaws, pinned down by unexpected resistance, hollered to each other, some dismounting, to find cover behind Redwood's fences and barrels. Lydia realized they intended to prolong the fight, possibly circling the ranch to set more fires. An outlaw with a flaming torch made a break for the orchard, likely aiming to set the young trees ablaze. Lydia's stomach twisted. So many months of careful growth, a living piece of Andrew's legacy. "No," she shouted, rising from cover to level her rifle at the intruder. She fired, catching him in the leg. He staggered, dropping the torch, which Harriet quickly stamped out. Another shot rang out from behind the orchard, someone else among the outlaws returning fire. Lydia dropped to her knees as bark splintered from the trunk behind her. Harriet hissed, "Keep down. They're pinned, but they're desperate." Ramsey's revenge, Lydia thought grimly. Frank was gone, but his ghost still loomed, fueling hatred among the surviving gang members. She crawled to a different vantage point, ignoring the sting of twigs beneath her palms. The orchard provided decent cover, though she worried it might become a tinderbox if a torch landed in the wrong place. Another bullet tore through the leaves overhead, showering them with shredded foliage. Harriet fired into the gloom, and a muffled cry followed, suggesting a hit. In the flickering chaos of half-extinguished torches and muzzle flashes, the outlaws discovered Redwood's defenders were more numerous, in better position than they'd anticipated. Kevin's steady firing from the barn loft pinned 2 men behind an old wagon. David and Anna Fletcher's son, Tom, had commandeered a spot near the cabin's door, driving back another attempt at rushing the porch. Lydia, heart pounding, realized they were holding their own. The outlaws had lost the advantage of surprise, and Redwood's scattered defenses formed a ring of iron resolve. Yet the fight was not over. A harsh whistle cut through the night, some kind of signal. The outlaws began a coordinated retreat, covering each other with sporadic gunfire as they fell back toward the slope from which they had come. One still carried a small torch, tossing it wildly to create chaos, but it fell uselessly in damp soil. Lydia exhaled in relief as the men vanished into darkness, their curses trailing on the wind. The entire ordeal had lasted perhaps 10 or 15 minutes, though it felt like hours. In the eerie stillness that followed, Lydia and Harriet crouched behind the orchard's largest tree, adrenaline still coursing. Smoke curled from the few spots where torches had landed, but the main structures were safe. Gradually, Redwood's defenders emerged from their positions. David ran over from the barn, panting. "They're gone," he confirmed. "But we need to check if any got left behind or if we have wounded." A quick survey revealed that Anna Fletcher's son, Tom, had suffered a graze to his arm, quickly bandaged by Harriet. Kevin Roberts nursed a bruised shoulder from being knocked into a fence post by a startled horse. The orchard sustained minor damage, broken branches, singed leaves, but had avoided a full-blown blaze. Miraculously, none among Redwood's defenders was gravely injured. The same could not be said for the outlaws. Two bodies lay in the yard, men who had refused to retreat or were too injured to escape. One moaned faintly, his torso bleeding from Harriet's shot. Lydia steadied herself, remembering the code of the frontier. Even an enemy might be offered medical help if safely disarmed. Sheriff Walters arrived at dawn with two deputies responding belatedly to Lydia's summons. The aftermath he found was a ranch yard scorched in patches, fences riddled with bullet holes, exhausted defenders with haunted eyes, and two outlaws tied up, one dead, the other barely alive. David recounted the entire skirmish, Harriet and Kevin adding details. Lydia, though shaken, presented an air of calm. "They said Redwood was cursed by Ramsey's death," she told the sheriff. "They came to burn it down as retribution." Walters exhaled, removing his hat as he surveyed the orchard's bullet-strewn branches. "This territory's a powder keg. That gang's a disease spreading from valley to valley. You handled yourselves well." He offered them quiet praise for their defense, then turned to the wounded outlaw who glared from behind swollen eyes. "Name," Walters demanded. The man spat out a mouthful of blood, refusing to speak. "We'll get him to the Silver Creek, doctor," the sheriff continued. "Maybe once he's stabilized, he'll talk." Either way, Redwood's proven it won't be an easy target. Lydia felt both relief and a lingering chill. Twice now, Redwood Ranch had faced deadly conflict, first with Hero's scheme and Frank Ramsey, then with Ramsey's vengeful gang. She wondered how many times she could endure such violence. The West offered grand possibilities, but the cost was high, measured in blood and bullet scars. Harriet's expression mirrored that of a woman who had seen enough death. "You going to rebuild your fences, or is this enough to drive you away?" she asked quietly once Walters moved on to direct his deputies. "I'll rebuild, Lydia," Lydia stated firm. She gazed across the yard where her orchard endured, battered but unbowed. Redwood might well become a symbol of defiance, a small ranch standing firm against the worst the frontier threw at it. Andrew Cudden envisioned Redwood as a place of growth, not a place of surrender. Harriet nodded, both admiration and worry etched on her face. "Then we'll help." She paused, a gentle smile emerging. "This community might be small, but it won't turn its back on someone who fights so hard to stay." Over the following days, Redwood's defenders returned to their own ranches or tasks, each with a sense of shared victory. Harriet and Kevin came intermittently to offer guidance in reinforcing Redwood's perimeter. Anna Fletcher, though preoccupied with her children, baked enough bread for an army and sent it with Harriet as a gift of solidarity. David remained a constant presence, stepping into a role of near partnership. He and Lydia spent long days mending bullet-riddled fences, replanting the orchard's damaged saplings, and tending to daily chores that refused to pause for tragedy. The battered orchard in many ways epitomized Lydia's experiences, besieged but hopeful. She spent evenings carefully pruning broken branches, applying salves to scorched bark, uncertain if the trees would fully recover. Yet each morning a handful of blossoms greeted her, insistent on survival. "Nature is resilient," Harriet had told her once, "and so are you." Indeed, Lydia discovered within herself a resiliency she had never imagined, a stubborn refusal to let Redwood become another casualty of lawlessness. Still, as the last vestiges of the outlaws' attack faded into memory, Lydia wrestled with a paradox. Redwood was fast becoming a stable ranch, recognized by neighbors as proof that a determined woman could succeed alone. But Harriet's gentle suggestions and Kevin's discreet offers of partnership reminded her that solitude did not have to be her final condition. Quietly, she weighed whether forging a new bond, whether through official partnership or something more personal, might bring Redwood to its full potential. Andrew Fisher's memory no longer anchored her to a singular path. She had honored his legacy, claimed it as her own, and faced tribulations beyond his darkest warnings. One evening, Harriet casually asked Lydia if she intended to remain single forever, or if she might consider forging alliances, maybe even remarriage with someone who shared Redwood's ideals. Lydia managed a small laugh, deflecting, I'm not sure I came here for marriage once, but life had other plans. Now Redwood is all the commitment I can handle. Harriet offered a knowing nod, yet Lydia sensed the question would resurface from Harriet, or from the territory's unstoppable momentum. By late summer, word had spread far beyond Silver Creek that Redwood Ranch, once the ill-fated property of Andrew Fisher, had not only survived repeated threats, but was thriving under Lydia Caldwell's capable hand. She had filed all necessary paperwork, overcame an ambush by the remnants of the Ramsey gang, and forged alliances with neighboring ranches that saw mutual benefit in cooperating rather than competing. A traveling journalist passing through on a wagon headed to Cheyenne stopped at Redwood to interview the woman who shot down Frank Ramsey. Lydia, flushing with modest discomfort, insisted that the story was not about heroics, but about protecting her own home. The journalist left with colorful notes, no doubt shaping a tale that would paint Lydia as a frontier legend. In early September, Harriet and Kevin Roberts hosted a harvest gathering at the H-Bar, inviting ranchers from miles around. Lydia arrived with David Lane, both sporting smiles that concealed the relentless labor it took just to keep Redwood afloat. The H-Bar's yard bustled with families exchanging produce stories, and the rare laughter that marked a temporary respite from frontier hardships. Harriet had roasted 2 whole turkeys. Kevin was running an open grill for the cattlemen, and a makeshift band of local fiddlers set a cheerful backdrop of music. Throughout the evening, neighbors approached Lydia to praise her orchard's progress or commend her for standing strong against outlaws. Anna Fletcher brought her children, who played tag among the bales of hay, while their mother recounted Redwood's transformation to any curious ears. Even Sheriff Walters made an appearance, tipping his hat to Lydia with professional respect. Heard Redwood's orchard is likely to produce a fine apple crop, soon he quipped. You might put the bigger ranchers to shame with that variety. At one point, Harriet cornered Lydia near the barn, gently nudging her toward a quieter corner. Kevin has something to say to you, Harriet murmured, her eyes gleaming. With a slight push from his mother, Kevin appeared hat in hand, looking more nervous than Lydia had ever seen him. For a moment, she anticipated a second marriage proposal. Her heart lurched with mild panic. But Kevin's expression soon revealed a different matter. I've been thinking about Redwood's orchard. He began scuffing the ground with the toe of his boot, and the fact that your orchard could double in size if you had more help. We at the H-Bar might invest. That orchard fruit could be sold in Cheyenne for a strong profit. Lydia exhaled, relieved to see Harriet's earlier implication might have been a red herring. So you're suggesting a business partnership for orchard expansion? She asked, intrigued. Kevin nodded eagerly, explaining how they could share costs of irrigation lines, orchard equipment, and a sales channel. In exchange, the H-Bar would receive a percentage of the orchard's revenue. Lydia's chest warmed with possibility. She had already considered orchard expansion, but the cost and labor had daunted her. This makes a lot of sense, she replied. We can draw up an agreement, define responsibilities, and begin improvements in the spring. Kevin's face lit up, and Harriet, listening from a short distance, gave them both a proud nod. Later, as Lydia strolled the yard, she paused at the circle of fiddlers and tapped her foot to a lively tune. David Lane and Harriet joined her, the 3 exchanging small talk about ranch chores. William Roberts approached with a grin, remarking that Redwood was fast becoming the territory's model of successful diversification cattle orchard, produced possibly even new gardens. Lydia found she could speak of Redwood's future without the shadow of Andrew's tragedy overshadowing her vision. She still honored him. His memory infused every row of that orchard, every fence post hammered into the soil. But the ranch was hers now, shaped by her choices with the promise of expanding alliances, rather than living in the solitary confines of mourning. As the harvest gathering wound down, Harriet teased Lydia about how Redwood was outgrowing its name. If you add many more orchard rows, you'll have to rename it Caldwell Orchard and Ranch, she joked. Lydia chuckled. She recalled the official land patent with her name stamped across it, the sealed documentation that recognized her as rightful owner. She recalled the gunfights, the endless chores, the friendships that had blossomed in adversity. She realized with a sense of profound fulfillment that Redwood had become a place where her dreams, Andrew's memory, and the territory's unstoppable spirit converged. In the final hour of the gathering, Harriet and Kevin offered Lydia a ride back to Redwood. Together, they journeyed under a blanket of stars that shimmered across Wyoming's vast sky. Lydia felt a kinship with those distant lights, each a steady presence in a cosmic wilderness. Redwood Ranch, too, glimmered like a small, steadfast beacon in a frontier that could be both savage and generous, heartbreakingly austere and brimming with possibilities. Once a mail-order bride with nowhere else to go, Lydia Caldwell now guided Redwood's destiny, forging a future that promised not just survival, but genuine prosperity on her own terms. At journey's end, Lydia stood once more on Redwood's porch, cherishing the peace that followed so many trials. The orchard she and her neighbors had nurtured now flourished, a testament to the resilience found under wide Wyoming skies. Sipping her evening tea, she reflected on how each challenge, from Ramsey's outlaws to financial uncertainties, had shaped her into a fearless leader. Redwood was no longer just Andrew Fisher's dream. It was also hers, made stronger by every test she had overcome. With new alliances and a flourishing orchard partnership, Redwood Ranch had evolved into a beacon of hope for others seeking their place in an untamed land. Rather than surrendering to fear or convention, Lydia forged her own path, proving that courage, friendship, and a clear vision could conquer even the harshest frontiers. If this story lifted your spirits or sparked ideas, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to support the channel and discover more heartening, triumphant tales.